It's all around us, in our cars, in restaurants, in retail stores, and on our phones. Even though we might not realize it, music is constantly surrounding us. And although there are hundreds of genres of music, you probably have your favorite. For most of the people around here, it's country. But for some of you, it could be classical or heavy metal, or my personal favorite, show tunes. But have you ever wondered how music got its origins? What most people don't know is that music actually got its start in the church. Now, you don't see people walking around and listening to hymns and Gregorian chants all the time. So how did music turn from sacred church songs to the hip-hop and pop we listen to today? Well, in this speech, we're going to take a trip through the ages and discover how music has evolved over time. To start, we have to go back hundreds of years to the Middle Ages. Although there was music before the 15th century, the Middle Ages was where music was a very common and important part of everybody's lives. Because of the domination of the church, everybody was required to attend. Gregorian chants were the main kind of music during the Middle Ages. Gregorian chants came from ancient religions and were single-line melodies that were sung by the whole church. These were different from the music we know today because they didn't have a meter to them or a beat. Now, it's hard to imagine not having the technology we do today that can print and publish music, not to mention the hundreds of programs that are available to create your own music without even touching a pencil to a piece of paper. And in the Middle Ages, they didn't even have pencils to draw out their music with. When people first started composing music, they used ink, but they didn't draw notes on a staff as we see it today. They noticed that if they drew the notes as circles on a piece of paper, that the notes would fall right off the page. So they drew very small dash marks and lines to represent music, which would be very hard to follow along with today. But that was okay, because most of the music during the Middle Ages was learned by rote, which meant that the chants were sung to a group of people who memorized it and passed it on to future generations. The next era we will discuss was called the Renaissance era. Now, the Renaissance era was a very important part of the evolution of music. During this time, the printing press was invented. This meant that music could be distributed on a worldwide scale. More amateur musicians who could not compose their own music now had an advantage, because instead of having to learn a song by rote or learning how to create music, they could get it printed on paper and purchase it. The printing press also created more opportunities for composers. Now, more secular music was being written and played. Secular music is non-religious music. With the start of secular music came polyphonic music, which was different than the Gregorian chants. Britannica.com describes polyphonic music as music that has more than one melody. After polyphonic music was invented, lots of opportunities arose for both sacred and secular music, which led to our next era. The next era was called the Baroque era. According to dictionary.com, the definition for the term Baroque is extravagantly ornate, florid, and convoluted in style. During the Baroque era, music was very detailed. Instead of playing or singing straight notes, appoggiaturas, or ornaments, were added before or after notes to add a different dimension. MetMuseum.org talks about how secular music was becoming more and more popular, and there were lots of different composers beginning to write music during this era. Also during this time, orchestra played a big part in the music industry. This was because there was now a way to tune instruments with one another. This process is called equal temperament and is still used today when making instruments. There are many different genres of music popping up during this time, and one of them was the opera. The reason these genres were popping up was because now it was becoming more and more popular to have women sing in them instead of only men. Some of the most popular composers during this time were Handel, Vivaldi, and Bach. They were considered virtuosos, who were musicians who had extraordinary technical abilities. In the next era, there are some very important virtuosos that had a huge impact on the music industry. The classical era is almost the exact opposite of the last era we talked about. As we discussed, the Baroque era was very ornate, detailed, and decorated. But during the classical era, everything followed a very strict pattern and was very simple. This was a very depressed time across the world. Both the American and French revolutions were fought during the classical era, so music became a very important thing for people to listen to take their mind off of the war. Some of the different genres that were invented during the classical era were sonatas and symphonies. A symphony is a large multi-movement work for an orchestra. Public performances of orchestras and choirs were very popular during this time, because during the Middle Ages, only wealthy people were allowed to appreciate music, whereas during this time, it was very common for everyone to appreciate music. And although music was still very highly prized, it was more and more acceptable for middle and lower class to enjoy concerts. And two of the most popular composers of all time came into stardom during this era as well. Mozart and Beethoven were very popular during this era and were considered national heroes to both the lower and middle classes. The commoners especially loved Beethoven because he was a nonconformist. He showed his individuality in his music as well. In what some critics believe to be his most famous piece, the Ninth Symphony, he used a different kind of form where he switched emotions with each movement of the symphony. Beethoven's individualism is one of the movements that began the next era in the evolution of music. Now you might think that the term romantic means lovey-dovey, but this era is called the Romantic era because of the idealistic views of music. Before this era, there was only one kind of music being performed at a time. But now that composers were breaking tradition and trying new things, lots of different kinds of music began forming. A man named Berlioz created the idée fixe, which meant that a melody in a piece would represent a character or main idea. This form of music is still used to this day in the songs we listen to, whether it be hip-hop or country. Another popular kind of music that originated during the Romantic era was vaudeville or parlor music. This kind of music used strophic form. Strophic form created the same melody in each verse during a piece. After strophic form was invented, the 20th century came along. And during the 20th century, music started taking off in all sorts of directions. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, and pop started forming. And while there were still composers, performers began being referred to as artists. They started selling albums which were available all across the world. All in all, music has taken a drastic jump throughout time, and even though it doesn't seem like it, much of the music you listen to today still uses the same forms that originated over 500 years ago. So now that we've gone through all of the eras of music, let's recap the evolution. In the Middle Ages, music was mostly in the church. But during the Renaissance, the printing press was invented, which led to the beginning of secular music. During the Baroque era, songs were very ornate and detailed. Secular music became more and more common, and there was finally a way for instruments to tune with one another. After the Baroque came the Classical era, where music made a drastic transition from very detailed to very simple. And now anybody had the right to enjoy music, not just the upper class. During the Romantic era, composers had minds of their own, composing all different kinds of music, and after strophic form was invented, a new way of performing music followed. In the 20th century, composers and artists took the ideas of strophic form and turned music into how we know it today, with verses that have the same melody and refrains that follow a main idea. So now you've learned how music transformed from sacred chants to the music you were probably listening to before I gave this speech. And next time you're talking to your friend about that new release, don't forget to think about how many years it really took to make that one song. Thank you.